Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carlos DeBrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, November 28th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and we might add the Philippines to that, too. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, though most Americans are barely aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, bad guys, of course, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world, not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. The American elite's concern for profits has meant that the center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the landmass from Eastern Europe to East Asia, not so much Europe or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the end of the 19th century, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of Eurasia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of Eurasia by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about. The Second World War. Conquering the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that the Japanese were setting up. That's why the U.S. left Russia to defeat Hitler alone in 1941, so the U.S. could concentrate on Japan. In World War II as a whole, the U.S. had perhaps 500,000 casualties. Russia lost perhaps 27 million in defeating Germany. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia, Russia and China, by retarding their economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to the effective alliance between Russia and China, and their alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's why the U.S. has 1,000, yes, 1,000, military bases around Russia and China. Russia has 15 bases outside its territory. China has 1. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on either side. The situation was described in 1948 in a secret State Department memorandum. Quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves," means the U.S., "and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves. We can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction." Close quote. Could hardly ask for a clearer statement of the world that the U.S. inherited from the Second World War. From World War II up to today, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain that economic control of the world. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the presidential campaign, Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting. Obama's war provocations against Russia and China, and Obama's drone assassinations, accurately called the greatest terrorist program of modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted Obama's war policies. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. The U.S. has been at war almost continuously since World War II, putting down challenges to its economic control of the world. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We try to give a better account tonight on AWARE on the Air. I'll start with a reference to our local daily newspaper, the News Gazette. They've been running reminiscences recently of the Vietnam War, a half-century after the fact. There is, perhaps because of the age of veterans and others, a certain interest at the moment, represented particularly by the Ken Burns series on PBS. The News Gazette has been publishing accounts from 50 years ago of people who were involved in various ways in the Vietnam War. What they've not done is note the parallels between the Vietnam War 50 years ago and the present Mideast War, the varieties in each case being summarized in one term. The war in Southeast Asia involved a good deal more than Vietnam. The U.S. attacked also Laos, Cambodia, and other countries in the region. And of course, the war in the Middle East involves a good deal more than Iraq and Syria, but nevertheless shows some remarkable parallels with the Vietnam War of 50 years ago. That war began in the Kennedy administration. We sometimes forget it was John Kennedy who attacked South Vietnam, and lasted 15 years. The current invasion of Southwest Asia, which began 15 years ago, a little more than 15 years ago, with the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, In the former, the Vietnam War, the Kennedy-Johnson-Nixon War in Vietnam was the greatest international crime of the post-World War II era. The latter war, the Bush-Obama-Trump war in the Mideast, is the greatest international crime so far of the current century. Our demand today, the demand of our organization, AWARE, and other anti-war groups across the country, is what it was in the midst of the Vietnam War. Bring all U.S. troops and weapons home. End U.S. invasions and war provocations. There are specifics of the current situation that also need to be known and are not well reported in the American media. For example, 7 million people are on the verge of starvation in the country of Yemen. Most Americans couldn't find Yemen on a map, but the government that they're responsible for is supporting a vicious attack on the people of that country, primarily by Saudi Arabia. Airstrikes and a blockade of food, using food as a weapon, starving the people of Yemen, is the modus operandi of the Saudis. The Saudis are presently ruled by an upstart princeling, Mohammed bin Salman, referred to in the international press as MBS, who has imprisoned and, according to many reports, tortured his relatives who are part of the House of Saud, the family that gives Saudi Arabia its name. He is fully supported by Washington. He is generating now the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet in Yemen, a starvation war against civilians. That is a war crime, a whole set of war crimes. But if you hear the American media on this point, you will hear a vague reference to Yemen, perhaps, but all of a sudden you will hear about suppressions of a population called Rohingya, a population that most Americans had never heard of until a couple of months ago. The suppression of the Rohingya, the oppression of the Rohingya, is being discussed at great length because it's in the interest of American foreign policy that the opposition to Chinese involvement with Myanmar in their Belt and Road Initiative run into problems. And one of the problems now is the charges of ethnic cleansing against Myanmar, charges that the Rohingya are the victims, and they do seem to be victims of a plot by the government of Myanmar and a government that is making arrangements with China that are not to the taste of Washington. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about some of the aspects of American war making as it exists today. I want to turn now to an account by a very interesting journalist who is not much known in this country, but should be. He's been writing well about the Middle East for a long time. His name is Jonathan Cook, and he lives in the town of Nazareth. Yes, that Nazareth that we will be talking about in the Christmas celebrations from 2,000 years ago. There's a Nazareth today. It's an important town that is in the midst of the Israeli oppression of the Palestinian people. And Cook, who has, I think, dual British and Israeli citizenship, lives in Nazareth and writes about what's going on in the Middle East. He has an important book called Israel and the Clash of Civilizations, Iraq, Iran, and the Plan to Remake the Middle East, and another one called Disappearing Palestine, Israel's Experiments in Human Despair. He knows what he's talking about, I'm afraid. He has an article this week entitled Syria, Experts, and George Monbiot. George Monbiot is also not much known to Americans. He's well known to British newspaper readers as a columnist for The Guardian who writes frequently on environmental and political matters. And since those are, after all, the issues that occupy governments around the world, he is looked on as a sage on some of these matters. Jonathan Cook here criticizes Monbiot on some specific issues regarding Israel and Syria. He begins with an account that comes from another dissident reporter, an American in this case, called Gareth Porter, also very much worth reading. Investigative journalist Gareth Porter has published 2 exclusives whose import is far greater than may be immediately apparent. They concern Israel's bombing in 2007 of a supposed nuclear plant secretly built, according to a self-serving U.S. and Israeli narrative, by Syrian leader Bashar Assad. So the background to the apparently looks like concluding war in Syria, a war that the United States is primarily responsible for. The background of that is this attack in 2007 by Israel, this bombing attack by Israel on what was said to be an attempt to build a nuclear weapon in Syria. The old line that the political establishment learns nothing and forgets nothing turns up again when we start thinking about the way that Iraq, Syria, and then Iran have all been charged in the last 15 years with buying or seeking nuclear weapons, and therefore they must be attacked for that reason. That sort of argument that we get from the United States and Israel is peculiar when we realize that the United States, of course, has an overwhelming control of nuclear weapons in the world at large, and Israel, in part because of the United States, has a nuclear armament, has perhaps 250 nuclear weapons of its own. The horror that Iraq, Iran, or Syria might get a nuclear weapon is offset by the fact that if they did, it would be for defensive reasons, and no one could doubt that the possession of one nuclear weapon would hardly be a threat to the nuclear superiority, to the nuclear dominance that the U.S. and Israel have in the region. But in any case, 10 years ago, Israel announced that it had bombed Syria, with which it was not at war, because Syria had a nuclear weapons plant, and they wanted to, quote, take it out. Although the attack on the nuclear reactor occurred a decade ago, there are pressing lessons to be learned for those who are analyzing current events, today's events in Syria. Porter's research, as Gareth Porter, the American reporter, indicates very strongly that the building that was bombed could not have been a nuclear reactor, and that was clear to experts in the International Atomic Energy Agency, even as the story was being promoted uncritically across the Western media. But, and this is the critical information Porter conveys, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, part of the UN, failed to disclose the fact that it was certain the building was not a nuclear plant, allowing the fabricated narrative to be spread unchallenged. Sound familiar? It abandoned science to bow instead to political expediency. The promotion of a bogus story of a nuclear reactor by Israel and key figures in the Bush administrations was designed to provide the pretext for an attack on Assad, just as a similar story was designed to provide weapons of mass destruction, remember, a pretext for an attack on Iraq, on Saddam Hussein in Iraq. That, it was hoped, would bring an end to his presidency, the presidency of Assad in Syria, and drag into the fray the main target, Iran. The Syrian nuclear reactor, in quotes, was supposed to be a rerun of the WMD deception in Iraq, used in 2003 to oust another enemy of the U.S. and Israel, Saddam Hussein of Iraq. It's noteworthy that the fabricated evidence for a nuclear reactor occurred in 2007, a year after Israel's failure to defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon. The 2006 Lebanon War was itself intended to spread to Syria and lead to Assad's overthrow, as I explained in my book, Israel and the Clash of Civilizations. This is Jonathan Cook, writing from Israel at the time. Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon made up of Shia Muslims that managed to expel Israel from parts of Lebanon in 2006. It's important to remember that this Israeli neocon plot against Syria long predated, in fact, in many ways prefigured, the civil war in 2011 that quickly morphed into a proxy war in which the U.S. became a key, if mostly covert, actor. The relevance of the nuclear reactor deception can be understood in relation to the latest efforts by Guardian columnist George Monbiot and many others to discredit prominent figures on the left, including Noam Chomsky and John Pilger, for their caution in making assessments of the much more recent events in Syria. Monbiot has attacked them for not joining him in simply assuming that President Assad of Syria was responsible for a sarin gas attack last April on Khan Sheikhoun, an al-Qaeda stronghold in Idlib province in Syria. Understandably, many on the left have been instinctively wary of rushing to judgment about individual incidents in the Syrian war and the narrative presented in the Western media. The claim that Assad's government used chemical weapons in Khan Sheikhoun and earlier in Ghouta was an obvious boon to those who spent more than a decade trying to achieve regime change in Syria. That is, primarily the Obama administration, and attempting to drive the president of Syria, Bashar Assad, out of office. And what has become an ugly habit with Monbiot, and one I've noted before, writes Jonathan Cook, he's enthusiastically adopted the role of witchfinder general. It takes a bit of an explanation, too, for an American audience. The Witchfinder General was a strange figure who emerged during the English Revolution, supposedly authorized by Cromwell, but probably not. In any case, he was a man who went around England discovering witches. This runs up to the fact that in our mythology, the Middle Ages was the age of witch finding. That wasn't true. It was the Renaissance and the period of 17th century that was obsessed with witches in England. And the high point of that, in some ways, was the work of this man who was considered the Witchfinder General, who went about England looking for witches, subjecting them to torture and imprisonment and killing them. What Cook is suggesting here is that George Monbiot, this liberal columnist known as an environmentalist, is busily become a witchfinder general for the witches who go so far as to suggest that President Assad was not responsible for the attacks that he was being credited with. Any questioning of evidence, skepticism, or simply signs of open-mindedness are enough apparently to justify the accusations that one is an Assadist, that is, one is a supporter of President Assad of Syria, or a conspiracy theorist. Giving house room to the doubts of a ballistic expert like Ted Postel of MIT, or an experienced international arms expert like Scott Ritter, or a famous investigative journalist like Seymour Hersh, or a former CIA analyst like Ray McGovern, is apparently proof that one is an atrocity denier, or worse. Monbiot's latest attack was launched in a moment when he obviously felt he was on solid ground. A UN agency, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, issued a report last month concluding that the 100 people killed and 200 injured in Khan Sheikhoun last April were exposed to sarin gas. Monbiot argues that the proof is now incontrovertible that President Assad was responsible, a position that he, of course, adopted at the outset, and that all other theories have now been decisively discounted by the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. There are reasons to think that Monbiot is seriously misrepresenting the strength of the organization's findings, as several commentators have observed. Most notably, Robert Perry, another leading investigative journalist, points out that evidence in the report's annex, the place where inconvenient facts are often buried, appears to blow a large hole in the official story. Once again, a UN organization comes forth with this story, but is clearly doing the propaganda work of the United States government. Perry notes that the time recorded by the UN of the photo of the chemical weapons attack is more than a half hour after some 100 victims had already been admitted to 5 different hospitals, some of them lengthy drives from the alleged impact site. But potentially more significant than such troubling inconsistencies are the conclusion of Gareth Porter's separate investigation into Israel's bombing of the non-existent Syrian nuclear reactor. That gets to the heart of where Monbiot and many others have gone badly wrong in their certainty about events in Syria. Monbiot has been only too willing to promote as an indisputable fact claims made both by highly compromised and unreliable Western sources and by supposedly reputable and independent organizations such as international human rights groups and UN's agencies. He, like many others, assumes the latter can always be relied upon to stand apart from Western interests and can therefore be implicitly trusted. That seems, in fact, not to be the case. There are examples which Jonathan Cook offers of this in the conclusion of the article. I will post this I'll post a link to this article on the Facebook page that Aware maintains, and suggests that if you want to follow up his argument, you can see it there. The important point is that the arguments about Syrian gas attacks are part of the general attempt by the United States to justify its support for a jihadist attack on the government of Syria, an attack that now seems to have been brought to an end after 5 years by the intervention of Russia and, to some extent, Iran. The decision by George Monbiot, this British liberal, and others to bury their heads in the sands of an official narrative from the United Nations, all the while denouncing anyone who seeks to lift theirs out for a better view, should be understood for what it is: an abnegation of intellectual and moral responsibility for those around the globe who continue to be the victims of Western military supremacism. You're watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 48th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks of ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. See No's notes for the month in the blog newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware, which also contains a link to Aware's recent anti-war teach-in on YouTube, put together by the omnicompetent Jason Liggett. There is a demonstration, a regular monthly demonstration by Aware against the war, to be carried out on downtown Champaign on the corner of Neal and Church Streets this Saturday from 2 to 4. A general demonstration against the war making around the world that the U.S. government is engaged in and most Americans don't know about. If you want to join us, we would be happy to have you, and we will have signs and information and so forth to be given to passersby on foot and in autos. We will conclude tonight's program with a video from RT on the decline of the American empire, an interview with Professor Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin, who explains the decline of the United States as a global power and the rise of China. There is also an interview with Professor McCoy, whose work I featured on this program some weeks ago, by Nick Turse, which is linked to on the AWARE Facebook page. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.